Good evening, Aisha Morris. Good evening, Brian Jordan. It's a pleasure to have you on CaribNation to talk about our great friend, Wilcox Morris, who left us not too long ago. Aisha, of course, is his daughter, and Brian, his stepson. Aisha, tell us about your father. Tell us when he was born and where he was born.
Sure. My dad, Wilcox Eugene Morris, was born on September 10th, 1948 in Tobago. His dad was Victor Morris. He was a painter in Tobago. And his mother, who's still alive, Myrtle Bascom Morris, is a homemaker, but she also is an artist herself. And as a child, he displayed early artistic abilities. By 9 years old, he was winning art competitions. I think one of his earliest pieces was a charcoal drawing that he did of the old woman and the crab, which is a folk story from one of his early school books. And he was surprised that it actually won some recognition in a competition in Scarborough. From there, he moved to New York. He did some showings at Greenwich Village and later on attended the Howard University in Washington, DC.
What did he study at Howard?
He studied art. He studied art. So he was able to take his passion, something that he loved, and to carry it all the way through college. Well, after he finished his degree, he did do some commercial art for a little while and realized at that point some of the struggles of trying to get your art to be sold, and he decided to join the military. And when he joined the military, he served as a medic stationed in Germany. And even as a medic stationed in Germany, he found time to do art exhibitions and really develop his craft and show it to the world.
Aisha, how many children did Wilcox have?
He has two biological children, myself and my sister, Anise Monroe. He has two adopted children, Brian Jordan, who's on the call with us, and Candace.
And your mother was or is?
Yes, my mother's name is Unetta Morris.
Outstanding. I'm going to talk in a little bit more detail with you a little later on about his legacy, the influence that he had on the West Indian community in the DC metro area where he spent most of his life. But let me go on to the southern part of the Caribbean where we have Brian Jordan. Brian, thank you for joining us this evening. Of course, you're a stepson of Wilcox Morris, and Sister Aisha has given us an introduction of his certainly his early days in Scarborough, his parents, and where he went to school, both in Tobago and later in Washington, and his occupation after graduation. Tell us about your connection with Wilcox Morris and the influence that he left with you, or the legacy that resides with you.
Well, I would have had the opportunity to meet who I would have fondly called then Mr. Morris when I was in elementary school. It came out of a situation of doing some, I think it was Mother's Day cards for the teachers at school, and one of them being acquainted with Mr. Morris at the time thought that it would have been beneficial for me to meet him. And I remember every single detail about the way in which he was that day when I met him for the first time. He had a very graceful way about him. You could definitely tell the persona of an artist. It was definitely just emanating off of him. He would stand in a room and you would know instantly that there was a spirit of calmness and peace that came over him. And with that became the welcome mat in meeting him and to taking on a process of mentorship through him. And we had a number of adventures, working with the carnival arts, working with the traditional arts, and we've even done some work in some sun sculpting at the time. I would say,
Brian, stop for a second there
oh,
because you mentioned Carnival, and of course, Aisha was giving us the introductory piece, and I didn't do that. But since you brought it up, I mean, there's a special resonance with regard to Carnival and Trinidad and Tobago. Can you share that with the listening audience? How important is Carnival in the culture of Trinidad and Tobago?
well, in terms of the culture of Trinidad and Tobago, one might say that Carnival stands out as a cornerstone, especially in a rapidly globalizing world. If you ask anyone outside of the nation, Trinidad and Tobago is well known for Carnival. It becomes the thing that attracts a lot of tourism, but it's more than just tourism and a product that's offered. It's largely an expression that came out of the history of Trinidad and Tobago, whereby persons find creative ways of expressing themselves, bringing together all the forms of arts. We're talking about music, the performing arts. We're talking about the visual arts. It's coming together in colors. It's coming together in sound. It's a total experience that's vibrant. There's just a whole lot of energy that just speaks a way that gives an identity not only to Trinidad and Tobago, but it gives an identity to the Caribbean. It's one of those unifying things.
So how do you think that that sort of fusion of African and European cultures, visual arts, influence of Wilcox Morris's art? I mentioned that because when Aisha was speaking earlier, she talked about the ever-present drum, how important the drum was in his artwork, that it seemed to have been represented in many pieces.
Yes, absolutely. Well, certainly as it pertained to that, the way in which he was connected to all of it, he had a particular expressive way in which that he always saw art in this way that was largely informed by his experiences, and certainly so the culture of Trinidad and Tobago, linking to Carnival, it definitely did have a lot of influence on his work. I do believe there was also a piece that he did called Queen of the Band, and that was one that I did remember, but largely so you could just see it in the energy of the brushstrokes. And he was a major fan of steel band as well, something that one would experience if they would come out to Carnival. So that was something that he really did enjoy. He shared it in his personal life. And some of these elements, as I would have mentioned earlier, they came out in his work as well.
Let me ask you, and after that, I want to Aisha, did he, when I was a child, I'd see you run in masquerade, because people would mask, not for COVID-19, I think, to hide their identity and to be decorated. Was he a mask man, meaning did he play masks and then to go into the carnival and design costumes and become part of the festival? Did you know him for that?
From the time I would have met him, now I personally am not a carnival person, right? But by the time I did meet him, he was the first, and for some they might consider it sadly, but sadly my last experience that came about with carnival. I know prior to him meeting me, he would have done an extensive amount of work in the area of costume designing. But at the time, he did introduce me to some of the elements in putting it together. And we did have one occasion where we had a band and the persons didn't show up to the band. Those who committed to play, and we ourselves found ourselves in the position having to play. At that time, he would have had me on board working mainly on the King and the Queen costume at the time, which for those that might not be familiar with it, one of the main aspects of a band that portrays what the band is about, the King and the Queen. And it was a whole lot of fun working on it. I would have learned an incredible amount, skills that I would have later been able to translate into other areas afterwards.
Okay, outstanding. Aisha, I'm coming for you now, because I know in one instance you may have been the queen of the carnival. I didn't say king.
Yes. So Brian is exactly right. Actually, one of my childhood memories with my dad would be playing in one of the first bands that I knew him to do, which was called Somewhere in Sherwood Forest. And I think that was around 1984. And I remember it was my first time playing mass. Pink, dressed up. I think my character might have been a sukuya or something. But I remember the arms of the costume were
For those who don't know, that Sukuya is akin to a flying witch, who, in the Caribbean, Afro-Caribbean folklore, flies at night in a ball of flame and enters your house surreptitiously and sucks your blood. So I of course, know that Aisha is more than that. But thank you very much, Aisha, for telling us you were in Sherwood Forest as a Sukuya. But
yeah, it was quite exhilarating actually to be
you
on
must
the
have been
streets.
about 2 years old or something.
Well, no, I think at that time I may have been around maybe 8 or 9. And I remember just wearing this headpiece and like parading in the streets of Tobago and just being so in awe that this was actually happening. This was my first time parading in costume in the streets. It was not the queen costume. I was part of a troupe of children and perhaps some adults, but it was a very fun experience for me.
Of course, great art transcends its time, but all artists, be they visual artists or those who ply the vocation of the pen and the written word, are all creatures of their time. And your father grew up after the war at a time of independence, at a time where people like Eric Williams wrote Capitalism and Slavery and led the movement for Trinidad and Tobago's independence from Britain. So it was a time that was not, let's say, for the wilting daisies of heart. It was made for hardy folk, many of whom would have had to have made a choice. Were they going to be part of the social transformation that was then ongoing, or were they going to stand aside and look? It was Bob Marley who wrote and sang a song. I think it's a redemption song. And in there, it says, "How long shall they kill our prophets while we stand aside and look?" And I want to share with both you and Jordan that it was that excerpt from that song that your father placed on a portrait with the South African freedom fighter Chris Hani, who was assassinated, and did a T-shirt project with me. And I'll never forget it because that's where my tax return of 1993 went, all of it, into that project. And I'm still looking for the, what do you call that, the silk screen for you, so he can maybe do another run in his memory. It was a nice piece. So he was a prophet in his own right. Is that right?
Wow. Well, I never heard anyone refer to him as such, but I appreciate that. He definitely, to me, was a visionary. He definitely did have his moments when he took on political causes and sought to improve the lives of others through his artwork and took on strong positions, such as you mentioned, his advocacy for Haiti, his looking at a coup that happened in Trinidad and Tobago and expressing that on canvas. So these were, and other causes that really touched him and moved him to create art that would then help advance society.
Mr. Jordan, Brian, your thoughts. The artist as poet, the artist as prophet.
I would certainly see that attempting to dissect and interpret, what that would have meant applying it to his life. I think I could definitely see moments where Dad certainly filled those shoes and more or less embodied it as he would have lived at the time. For certain, in terms of the poetic aspects of his art wasn't shallow. It wasn't the type of art you would look at that was meant to serve an aesthetic function that is just simply meant to beautify a space. No, many of his works would have dealt with a lot of controversial things. It would have confronted a lot of issues in Caribbean life. It would have brought to the attention a lot of ways of culture. And it was always deeper than at the surface. So in a way, I would say his art did exemplify an aspect of poetry. In terms of prophecy, that one is a tough one if I could define it. But I would say that for his work, it certainly did fulfill largely what it would mean to look to the future, to look at how things are unfolding, especially in terms of himself, not so much his work, but I would say himself, because he in his own right was a leader that would have worked with a number of different artists. He never worked alone. He would have done a lot of revamping of the art scene when he came back to Trinidad and Tobago. I know that's something that he would have contributed to, and as well as serving in the community as well. He would have definitely been a light to the youth, myself included, and having benefited from that. So in terms of that way of being a visionary, in terms of being provident, he certainly filled those roles.
Brian, thank you so much. I'll come right now back to you, Sister Aisha, in being provident. I mean, that's a man, that is Mr. Jordan, who's got a certain degree of facility with the English language. And I want to let you know that Wilcox had that facility with the brush. Did he use the brush, that is the paintbrush, in a way to leave us a legacy? And if so, what would that legacy be if you could describe it, Aisha?
Well, I think his artwork is his legacy, and the numerous paintings that he did, the numerous logos that he has left throughout the world, in people's homes and banks, hotels, the residences of some heads of state, all across the globe. I think that's his legacy. And also, I believe he leaves us a message of being able to express yourself creatively. That was something that he sought to do within the depths of his soul. And I believe he sees that everyone has a special gift, and no matter how they choose to express it, that everyone has creativity within them, and that he would encourage us all to express that.
Tell us about the environment he grew up in. What role do you think that played?
Sure. His parents were Christian. His father was an Anglican. His mom is a Methodist, and they did have religious books in the house. And in those books were paintings that captivated my father's imagination from an early age. And he mentioned sitting there looking at those books for hours upon hours, just so intrigued with them. And I think that really sparked something in him, a light in him, and guided him to his path as an artist.
Would you say that he was also a teacher? And tell us where the sort of whole idea of teaching a new generation, how did he manifest that, if he possessed that desire to teach others?
Well, I remember as a child in Tobago, he would have art classes at the Fort King George, and he invited children throughout the island to come. He invited other artists to come and share and have workshops. He gave workshops to youth and adult at that time. And I know that he continued that in his later years. But even when I think about growing up with him in the house, he practically raised me as a single father. And he was always willing to share his talents. He always, even learning the steel pan was something that he sort of introduced me to, because he had a pan at home, and the Bob Marley songs that you mentioned earlier, he tried to show me a little, don't worry about a thing.
Can you play any?
Well, because of him, I was inspired to join a couple of steel bands in the DC area. Well, one in the DC area. I started with one in Tobago, but it's been a while since I've played. And Actually, a few days ago, I sought out a steel band here where I am in the Virgin Islands because I wanted to become more connected to that history
Yeah.
that I've been separated from for a little bit.
As I talk about legacy, and you've talked about his orientation towards teaching others, Brian, why don't you touch on that? Because I believe you may have been a quite dutiful student of Wilcox, and tell us what you learned from him in the visual arts and his legacy of teaching in Tobago and in Trinidad.
When he would have met me, I wasn't even a teenager at the time. I remember going back to the basics, learning about the elements of art, the principles of design, and he would often put me on a weekly basis, sometimes a monthly basis, to study a couple artists, look at the styles of the works, grow to really appreciate how these things would have contributed to the growth of art as a timeline to the point that we would have been at. And it wasn't just about the two-dimensional art. As I would have mentioned earlier, he definitely took it beyond what my limits of imagination was. And he had introduced me to the time to doing sand sculpture, something that I wish we had more time to continue. He was planning all of these things. In terms of working with youth, he would often work with organizations like the Tobago House of Assembly, where he would be in youth outreach programs. And it's not even there. He even deals with the aspect of the community that one might be ready to discard I remember him working with the Tobago House of Assembly, also teaching arts to the elderly. That would have been at the Masonal Home for the Aged. And through that, he would have also overseen a lot of programs that allowed youth and teaching to happen, namely so with the Tobago Visual Arts Association that would have really came out of the Tobago Heritage Festival. And I remember him having a couple of workshops even during the summer that would have allowed youth, because school was out. So he capitalized on moments like that to impart aspects of the culture as it intertwined with the arts. He really, really was passionate about working with youth and allowing them to benefit from all his experiences, all of his knowledge. And it was never about the money. It was never about what he was going to get in return. It was always about what he could share with others.
Give us a bit of his character in way of his style of speaking and his manner of instruction and his personality for those who did not have the honor and privilege of meeting him.
Yes, he was certainly one that was quite gentle and articulate. He would be very careful about the things he would say, how he would say it. And the thing about it is, it was never about any classism or anything that could separate him in a way in which he communicated. Because if it's one thing he was skillful at, was code switching when it came to communicating. If he was working in a community project.
Stick a pin in there. You said something that's rather sophisticated that an older man like me may have missed. You said code switching. Now I see Aisha smiling. She's a superb journalist. She maybe knows what you mean. Code switching. What do you mean by that?
Yes, so by code switching, implying the idea of him employing certain aspects of communication, whether it be choice of words, him tapping into the Tobagonian Creole when it was necessary. So based on his audience, he would know exactly what to say and how to say it. And so that was the kind of person that he was, and largely so. He didn't just speak in a verbal sense. He spoke also in a way through his artwork as well. His instructions were never difficult. He would never give you a long list of things to do. It would often be from the simplest point. And that's how I knew largely so he had the personality of a teacher, because he wasn't interested in being recognized as this superb one. If the function or the goal was to impart something to someone or assist someone, he would communicate it in a way that was intended for you to understand. Not that you would be totally surprised by his aura, but largely so, that was like a corollary. It was like, it was like a natural thing that also came with him. You couldn't help but also be in awe of his personality, just how gentle, just how gifted he was, and that humility, that grounding in all of that gifting. And that really does also inspire anyone that would have had the opportunity to interact with him as long as I would have. So that's something that I was really happy to have shared in with him.
As we come to the end of this wonderful, insightful, documentary on the life of your father, Wilcox Morris, Aisha, tell us your thoughts about the artist as creative genius and the legacy your father left behind.
Yeah, I really see artists as some of the most special people in the world. They give us a medium to communicate with that transcends words and really is able to open us up to our own souls. And they're the most special gift that we have, to me. So I truly appreciate the artists, whether they are the visual artists, as my father was, or the many other areas of art that he dabbled in, such as limbo dancing, carnival band, yes, carnival band creating, and steel pan organizing. So many areas of art that he touched and so many lives that he touched. And this is what the artist does without speaking a word. They're able to have this effect on our whole society that tends to elevate us, I believe, toward a higher purpose.
Outstanding, elevating us towards a higher purpose. And that is what in many ways Wilcox did. He called us to our better selves. He supported worthy causes in humanitarian efforts in Haiti. He supported African liberation. He supported humanity's cause. Humanity's cause was his cause. And that work were viewed through the prism of the charity spirit that he possessed, I think will live forever, because it was not work disconnected from the reality in which he lived. His art was reflective of the reality in the Caribbean, in the United States, the social struggles and causes of the time. He did not stand aside and look, as in that song by Bob Marley. He threw himself right in. And instead of wielding a sword or anything foul, he wielded the most pristine tool one could use, the painter's brush, and created a blazing sunset that will forever live with us. Aisha, I want to thank you and Brian for describing our friend Wilcox Morris.